the only way to come here was by ship. So he settled in Seattle, and he had to find a way to get to Buffalo. And the only way to get to Buffalo then was by train. And during this time, right about this time, George Pullman had created the Pullman Porters, which are the former Black slaves who were hired by George Pullman to serve as porters in the rail cars for the wealthy white travelers. And so these Black porters, my father told a story about he was just taken under the porter's wings, and he was harbored in the train, and his job at the end of the night was to unravel some cigarette butts that had not been totally smoked through. And he'd take out the unused tobacco, and they'd make fresh cigarettes, and he'd smoke them with the porters for going to bed. He was 15 years old. And the porters, who understood this plight of racism and persecution against the Chinese, because they had this country was just anti them too. And so through the kindness of the Black porters that my father kept talking about, my father was able to get to Buffalo on that train for free.
And then joined the Army.
He joined the Marines. And so my father came here with a 5th grade education. He didn't speak any English. He just knew nothing, but he loved chemistry, which I think is what eventually made him a good bartender and a good restaurateur. But he then saved up enough money to go to New York University. And he majored in accounting. And one of his professors was Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson. And my dad decided he too wanted to stay in this country and give back to this country. He joined the Marines, and he was in the intelligence operation. So his job as part of his troop was to go to China and dismantle the Japanese ammunitions that had been left behind after World War II. So he had to go find out where they were. And then he was stationed in Qingdao, China, where he met my mother.
You think this is a good time to
I'll show
transition to your slide?
some photos. Yeah, sure. Now there's no. Just go back a little bit here. Can we queue up? There we go. So that is the letterhead of Mahjong Restaurants on New York. This is what we were like. This works? Better? Okay. I'll just stand behind you. That's okay.
Turn it on.
That's okay. So this is a photo of my family. So we were primarily a family together more often at the restaurant than we were at home. And this is what we just did every day. This is what I looked like when I sold cigarettes, by the way. So by the time when I was 6 years old, my mother got a little worried that I kept selling cigarettes, which I loved to do because we didn't have a vending machine. My mother got cartons of cigarettes, and my job was to unpack the cigarettes and put them in the cigarette case and line them up packet by packet. And cigarettes are 45 cents in those days. And I had a little change box, and I learned how to count change back, and I had to reconcile. So I did a little bit of counting as a young girl. I had to reconcile and account for all the sales of cigarettes in a little sheet of paper. And then by the age of 6, my mother got a little worried that I just loved to inhale the tobacco in the case. So she had me go help at the bar and put toothpicks and cherries and pineapples. So I sat at the bar, and my mother said, "You're good for business," because people kept coming over to say, "Oh, how cute you are," and people kept buying more drinks. So I just kind of hung out there, and it got crowded. And what I learned was I had no intention to be a bartender or drink, although not at that age. But what I learned in hindsight is that taught me how to engage in the art of small talk and how to make people feel comfortable. I was very comfortable with people growing up as a young girl. I don't know why, but I think that is what I've carried through my career as I am now a CEO of arts organizations. That's what I look like handing out sugar. Come on over and come on. That's the nightclub. So the nightclub was on the side of an old potato barn. And this is what it looked like when we were growing up, and people got dressed up in those days. This is a picture of my mother. That is a cigarette case where I sold cigars and cigarettes, and I came up not quite to the height of that counter. So I would lean in and I would climb in there and hand out, get the cigarette, climb out, and then go on tiptoe to hand it to the customer on the other side of the counter. I talk a lot about the Asian hate. These are photos of what inspired me to write this. We're not the virus. We're not to blame. This is the man who started my family. This is Jesse Boardman Hartwell Jr. He also spent time living in San Francisco that I'm currently exploring his roots here in the Bay Area. But he was a very prominent man in our history. The woman on the second to the right is Mary Hartwell, my great grandmother, and she's seated next to her husband. That very big man is my great grandfather, and behind them are their three boys, and that boy in the middle is my grandfather. And this is the picture of my grandfather Frank and his wife Kate with all 7 children. And this is one of the last photos of this family, all intact. My grandfather left home because he had an affair with a young girl who was my mother's classmate. And he left home to be with that classmate. He chose to stay and forge a life with that classmate. And I talk a little bit in the book that when it came time for him to come out of China, and before Mao sealed after Mao sealed the borders, he didn't want to go. His last words to his wife, my grandmother, as she was coming to the United States, was, "I'll see you in heaven." So he never made it out. But I also tell the story about a little bit of karma, that his concubine died, and he decided he did want to come to the United States after all. And so his children tried to find a way for him to get to the United States through an intermediary. Now, my grandfather was a very successful businessman with Western connections. They had connections to the Shell Oil. He worked for Qingdao Railroad. So, and through Mary Hartwell, who was raised Western, my grandfather had very Western roots. They spoke English as well as Chinese. So he changed his name, or had a different name, when it came time to meet the man to give him the fake papers to come to the United States to be with the rest of his family. And so they missed the connection. The person that was supposed to get him on the boat went by a different name, and he missed the connection and had to give up and never came out. So I treasure this picture of my family because it's the last photo of innocence of this family. This is a picture of the elders as they grew up, but this is the picture of my Aunt Mamie, the one who did the nursing, and that's the man on the right, her husband, who invented the research for the vomit comet, which looks like this. And then there is Paul Meng, who ran the China Institute that I mentioned for many years, and Henry Luce, who was the founder of Time. His family gave the money to start the China Institute's new building in New York, and this is the grand opening. It opened on Confucius's 2,495th birthday, and my Uncle Paul is on the far left, standing in the back, and to his left is Henry Luce. That very serious doyen in the front row is Henry Luce's mother. And my Aunt Bertha is the second woman to the right. And this is my Uncle Teddy, the only boy in the family. Now, he married a woman named Emily, but my Uncle Teddy was a very successful and renowned structural engineer. He designed and kept designed buildings, many of which you might know, but the most famous one perhaps might be the TWA building at JFK. This is now, they've saved the building, thank goodness. It's now a hotel, for those who don't know. And my Aunt Emily is credited from the New York Times for having introduced Mushu pork to the United States. So again, my family's contributions. This is a picture of my father, and this is a picture of the Pullman Porters, a stock photo, and this is their wedding photo. And then this is the photo of the last picture of my father and my mother and my sister in their arms, and my grandmother, just as they were getting on the last military ship leaving Shanghai to come to the United States. when they came to the United States, they raised a family. They had another son, my son named Lowell. They settled in San Francisco. And the pandemic of that time was tuberculosis. And the only cure for tuberculosis was to just cut out the lung. And so my mother contracted TB. She inadvertently gave it to her son, Lowell, who died at the age of 15 months. And my mother had never wanted to have any carnation near her ever, because it just reminded her of the bouquet. But my parents were so poor in those days, they couldn't afford a tombstone for Lowell. They scraped up enough money to put a couple of toys to put in the casket. There wasn't a service. My parents were very poor when they came to this country. They came with really nothing. And this is a picture of my mother who was recuperating in a sanatorium. They had a lot of sanatoriums in the United States to treat TB patients, and this particular one was in Redwood City. This is now getting back to where I come into the picture, where my editor said, when you come in the picture, this takes a whole different spin. But this is Long Island, New York. It's part of New York, and we grew up in the area shaded in green in a town called Syosset. New York City is to the left, right? So it's a very Long Island. That's what I call it, Long Island. And Long Island at that time was known for its potatoes. Long Island potatoes were very famous. And there were potato fields. So the Mahjong restaurant was an old potato barn that had not been developed by anybody yet. And so when my father went to try to assimilate, the first person that he met said, you should join the Kiwanis Club, just volunteer because you'll meet the greatest people, right? We make great people when we volunteer. And so he met a banker who was the president of Long Island National Bank, who gave him the money, no paper, just gave him the money to buy the potato barn. These were the days when a handshake deal was all you needed. Now, what was interesting about Long Island is, for those who don't know, the first suburb in the United States was Levittown, created by a man named Bill Levitt. And Bill Levitt created Levittown and I didn't realize I was still doing this research, but Long Island was incredibly segregated. There are 291 communities in Long Island. And in the 1970s, when I grew up there, 99.4% were white. Asians were 0.3%. We didn't even have a percentage point. But Bill Levitt, in creating these segregated communities, had a covenant that said, we will not sell to any member of the Negro race. Because if we sell a house to a member of the Negro race, then no white people will buy. And he said, we can solve a housing problem, or we can solve a racial problem. We can't solve both. And for those of you who don't know the name Robert Moses, Robert Moses is, there's a wonderful new film that just came out by Ray Fiennes about Robert Moses, who created the causeways and the parkways. He intentionally, it is now discovered, built these access to beaches so that people of color couldn't access them from New York. The bridges were lower so buses couldn't get through them, those kind of things. This is the place where we landed as Chinese people on Long Island. And so be that as it may, in spite of all of that, the banker, who is the man in the white coat with his arm draped around my father, was there to celebrate the grand opening of Mahjong restaurant, the barn converted into a restaurant. When we were growing up, Dad loved to go into the city to research other restaurants, and so we would go to Trader Vic's. Trader Vic's was a go-to place. They had a bib lettuce, and it was just a big change from Long Island. And also in what is not known is in the quadrant of Manhattan, there were several Polynesian restaurants there. There was Hawaii Kai, there was the Hawaiian Room, the Hotel Lexington Hotel, that recruited Hawaiian dancers directly from Hawaii. These were authentic floor shows. And the most famous one of all was Hawaii Kai. Hawaii Kai was started by a producer, TV producer, who hired a set designer to design the interior of Hawaii Kai. And it looked like this. This is brand new in the 1960s and 70s. We never saw decor like this. That's what restaurants look like. And Hawaii Kai had entertainment that went on till 3 a.m. And Hawaii Kai, if you're ever in New York, Hawaii Kai was at the side of the now Winter Gardens on Broadway. Winter Gardens is where Cats played for many years. In Disneyland, the new Tiki Room opened up, right? So there was this whole interest in Hawaii that became a state in 1959. And so there was this wave of curiosity about all things Chinese and Asian, and Flower Drum Song opened on Broadway, directed by Gene Kelly. And Gene Kelly hired dancers to be in the chorus. And 2 of the dancers in the Flower Drum Song production in New York were dancers at Mahjong. So, and I talked to Gene Kelly's widow, Pat Ward, about any memorabilia she might have. So we're trying to find some interesting goods that she might have had of his in her library. But this is the Ala Moana Shopping Center in Oahu. It was built as the largest open air shopping center in the world in those days. And phase 2 would be Polynesian entertainment. So it was against this backdrop, this fury of interest in Polynesia, that our family went to Hawaii for vacation. And it was a transformative moment because it built in us a lifelong love for the Polynesian culture. And it gave Dad the impetus to start an extension for Mahjong that had been filled to the gills for lunch and dinner. So we needed to do an expansion. And so he worked with an architect to take the barn and have it look like this. Have a look at that stone. That's the stone facade. And that stone facade was put together by hand, by laborers who took rocks and measure them and carve them and put them together. But that place was put together by hand. And it is the only building like it in the world. And I hope it's still standing. But when the decor is finished, this is the new extension of the dining room. It looks like Trader Vic's, doesn't it? And it became the Aloha Room as an homage to the Hawaiian spirit of love and friendship. And it became this go-to place where I began to become a dancer at the age of 11. Thrust into this world of learning how to dance. And as you can tell, I was so geeky, I had no parts to me then. But I grew up in this environment, and no Polynesian floor show is complete without a Polynesian, a Samoan knife dancer. And this is a true Samoan chief. His name is Chief Taofi. And those are real knives. They're long cleavers with very sharp hooks. And he did this number where he would take the knives, he'd twirl them, and he'd come on stage with a pineapple, and he'd lop off the pineapple, and he'd give it to the person in the front row. And then he'd do this dance, and then he'd take the cleavers together and he'd swirl them around, and people were just horrified. So I was asked to learn the sword fight, not the sword number. And Taofi taught me how to do it. And the only place where we could rehearse was on the redwood deck of our house, because Mahjong was so busy and there were cars in the parking lot. So he would come and teach me how to take my own knife, which was about 5 pounds. That's heavy for a young girl. And I had to twirl the knife and build up muscle. And so I finally was able to do this number. But the one thing that you should remember is when I rehearsed this on the deck of our house, I wore glasses. And in the show, we didn't wear glasses. So I did this with 2200 eyesight. And I often caught the hook on my calf, and I dropped the knives. But he told me, just keep going, keep going. And so what I learned was keep going, that that I just pull through it, plow through it. It was a little bit like the show must go on, but it was also that you made a mistake, just keep going. And these are one of the many valuable lessons I learned. So I mastered this, and then there was an idea to, hey, Taofi does a knife dance. And the knife dance is he takes those swords, but he also had a version that had rags around them that he would soak in benzene, and he'd light them on fire, and he'd do a fire dance. And this was what wowed people all the time, that this is him at the climax of his number, where he would actually put the fire on his feet and just stay there. Stay there. So then the idea came that Debbie should do a fire number. And I thought, okay, so first of all, our redwood deck was dented and nicked from all the times I dropped the knives. But he had the idea to put a big industrial wok in the backyard of our deck. And it was on a stand, and I had to practice stepping up and getting my balance. 1 foot at a time, 1 foot down, next foot down. Keep it and do some hand motions and swirl and then he would light the wok with fire. He would scatter it with rags, soak it in benzene, and then he just light the fire and he said, "Go on it." And I stepped on, and it. You know how hot fire is painfully hot on your feet. I had to practice by walking on asphalt and pebbles to get calluses on my feet. But no matter how many calluses you have on your feet, you can still feel the fire. At 13 years old, you can still feel fire. So I practiced getting up there, and I could get on there for about 2 seconds. And he'd say, "Stay 3 seconds." As the fire is licking your calves, it's that high. And then I'd step down, and I'd step down, and then he'd have the garden hose and he'd spray them on my feet, and I'd hear to cool off my feet. But I never did the number because I said, I don't want deformed feet. I'm going to the prom. I've got to wear shoes. So I never did that number, but I did do other numbers in the show. And Dancing the Light talks about my life as a young girl growing up in this environment, which was frequented by sports characters, by the mob, by union members, priests. I mean, there are all kinds of stories about the environment that we grew up in. And my father loved to gamble. And so it was remarkable that for a Chinese New Year, we would close the restaurant and we have the nice banquet. We'd all look very nice and formal. Then after everybody left, the lights would turn off and the dining room became a gambling den. Out came the cards and the dominoes and the chips. And so we just grew up learning how to watch all these gamblers. And I figured out that I could watch body language and I could see when somebody had a very good hand. And I'd go and stand next to him. I was a cute little 8-year-old girl. And when they won a hand, they'd give me some money. Well, I thought this is pretty good. 1 year I made $200, which is more than which is pretty good in those days. And so I learned how to. I just love growing up in the environment of gambling. Now, it was also a point of friction with my mother and father because finances were very, very tough. It's hard to run a restaurant. It's just so big and so much inventory and so many people to manage. And so my father oftentimes stayed behind to gamble and didn't tell my mother. And I tell the story about one day he didn't come home. And my mother is a pistol. She wrote in magic marker on the wall, "Did not come home tonight." And he came home and he looked at it, he went to bed, got her mad. And he did it again. And I was walking to school and I saw on the curb some of my father's pants on the curb. And I looked and I thought, what's that? And I looked and she cut the crotch out. Yeah. So, and he didn't do that ever again. But I told about my mother and this is before she went to self-assertiveness classes. But we grew up in this kind of wonderful environment. Another picture of me dancing that I do not have the body for that anymore. But this is the picture of my parents at the nightclub in the heyday. And I talk a lot about how they started their restaurant with the spirit of giving back, like all of my aunts and uncles that I mentioned to you. But we were situated across from Syosset Hospital. And unbeknownst to a lot of people, my mother and father would drop off food there for the nurses station. If my mother heard that a customer's child was having surgery, getting tonsils taken out, she'd bring a toy over there. So they taught us how to grow up in this spirit of empathy, giving back, compassion, and it's known as philanthropy today. I didn't know it, but I grew up in that world of philanthropy. And I'm really quite honored to be their daughter. I just feel that there's just so much of them in me as I write this book, as I look back on these elders. And these are my mother's siblings. As you saw the picture of them as they were young kids. This is what they looked like at 30, as they became 50-year-olds, and as they matured into their senior twilight years. keeping together, staying together was such a core value. And I just honor that so much. So this is a picture of my other great grandmother that I never met. Another moment of calm and peace before that family broke up. And so I should close by telling you who the four women on the photo are. The two women on the left are my two great grandmothers. The woman on the second to the right is my grandmother, my mother's mother, and the woman to the right is my mother. So I'm very, very honored to be telling their story. And I called it Dancing in Their Light because I am dancing in their light. And I carry their inspiration. And I talk in my book about how I can trace my family's lineage to 13 generations. Each of those generations has a value that they assigned as what their family ethos would be, whether it's music, whether it's reading, but nowhere in there was there a value of war or killing. But in that lineage, it was all about learning, language, poetry runs very strong, education, it runs very strong in my DNA. And so writing this book made me realize truly the kind of woman I have become. And if I ever grow up, I would love to grow up to be like those elders. So thank you for letting me share some of our family pictures with you.
It was awesome and hit about 90% of my questions. But I do have a few others. Mostly they're just little funny things, but one thing I wanted to, given the success and prestige of a lot of your family, what sort of pressures did you feel about how your success was going to be measured? And how did that fit into what you didn't do well and what you did do well in school, and how did it shape what you eventually became? If that makes any sense.
You know, I'm very lucky that I think my siblings and I are very lucky that my mother just told me, just be who you want to be. She didn't want me to be a doctor. She just didn't put that pressure on me. I was a terrible student because growing up at the nightclub, I danced on Wednesday nights. And so classes the next morning, the first class I had was economics and math. So I was terrible at it because I was just on restaurant hours. Restaurant hours are different than school hours. And on weekends, we were up all night. We had a 9 o'clock show and a midnight show, and we didn't get home until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning because we stopped off. We ate after my midnight show, which was 1 o'clock in the morning at the restaurant. Then we go to the diner, we'd have cheesecake. We'd wait for the Sunday paper. So we didn't get home Sunday until like 4 o'clock, and then my rhythm was off by the time I got to school. So I was a terrible student. Mercifully, choir was in the afternoon and drama classes. And that's where I really, really excelled. But my siblings are far more achieved than I am. My sister's a doctor. My brother's a very accomplished CPA. I didn't get that gene pool. I got something very different. And I never felt any pressure to measure up. I always felt that I'm just who I am. And I think that being in the culture of arts, you learn to accept people for who they are. I was in a choir where none of us could really sing. We were all from different backgrounds, but it was okay. You didn't have to be a singer to be welcomed into this club. And one of the reasons why I've gravitated to the arts as a career is because we're so accepting and welcoming of people in our audiences, of any kind of aptitude. And so for me, the place that I fit in the most and where I felt welcomed for my little brain was in the arts, because I think what I made up for it was I knew how to talk and tell a story by sitting at the bar all those years, putting those damn toothpicks in the cherries. And I learned how to not take myself so seriously. And my mother had a wicked sense of humor. There's a lot of humor in our family, and we've learned to make fun of ourselves. And so I just grew up, and the more I got into that, the more comfortable I was with just who I am.
You also mentioned in the book a show you went to, a Guy Lombardo show, as having an influence on your.
Does anybody know Long Island that well? So, you're from Long Island? You're from Syosset? Do we know each other? Well, you should tell the stories. See, somebody who remembers the food, somebody who what is it about the food? And people just say, and one of the things I talk about in the book is we don't harvest food like this anymore. We don't, rice is grown differently. We have lean animals now. The mantra in our the kitchen was the more fat, the better. Bring on the lard. And I talk about, people say, what made the egg rolls and dragon rolls so delicious? You know why? Here's the secret. You could never say it then, but do you know what caul fat is? It's the stomach lining. So no part of an animal is wasted in the Chinese culture. Use every part of the animal in the kitchen. So that caul fat was used as a wash over the wonton, the egg roll wrappers. And so when you fry caul fat and omentum, that gives it that flavor. It's probably terrible, but that's was one of the secrets. You could never say, would you like your egg rolls with caul fat or no caul fat? But Jones Beach. So Jones Beach was a very famous place to go. And one of the places was, it was this huge, it's this outdoor amphitheater for 6,000 seats. And you sit on as an audience here, but there's an island. And the ritual was that at the start of the show, there was a motorboat that came out with a flag and with a man with a hat. That was Guy Lombardo. And he would motor in, he'd get out, and he'd lead the orchestra in the Star Spangled Banner, and then he'd lead the show. So we saw South Pacific there, which was transformative. But for me, as a young girl, seeing this majesty of sets and lights and Guy Lombardo coming by, and to me, it was just so magical. And it's one of the reasons why I've always wanted to make sure that I bring arts experiences into the lives of young people, because you will never forget it. It will move you in ways that you won't remember till you would never forget.
Can you tell us some of the organizations you worked for as an adult?
So what I didn't mention in the book was after I went to USC, and I'm very sorry to mention that because he went to Cal. but when I went to SC, I intended to major in music. I played piano and guitar growing up, but I'm also very klutzy. And so when it came time for my piano audition, I couldn't do it because I jammed my finger playing field hockey. And I had to pick another major. It was like the theater. Yeah, that's it. So I picked theater and I applied to USC, and I wanted to go far, far away from home. I didn't want to be tempted to go back in case I ran out of money or I was lonely. My mother said, when you go, you go. So I just went and I drove cross country, and I said, if I'm ever, and I hated it when I went there because it was also Los Angeles. They had no good bagels, and forget about the cheesecakes. So this was pizzas, never mind. It was just torturous to be there, but I learned to love it, and I gave it a chance. And then when I graduated, I was off payroll for the most part. So I had to go find work. I had no clothes. I had no work clothes. And so I applied for a job at the old Broadway department stores. And they put me in the coat department. Now, who the hell buys a coat in Southern California? And it was on commission, so I had to sell coats to pay the rent. Those were the days when restaurants were in the department stores, and the coat department was next to next to the restaurant. And there were lines of people coming out of the restaurant waiting to get in, and I just tried to sell them a coat, and they wouldn't buy it. So I was in the break room one day, and I saw these guys with uniforms on that said HVAC. And I said, what is that? And they said, it's heat and air conditioning. I said, oh, can you make the coat department colder? And they said, yeah, I think so. So they made the coat department colder. And so I worked the line, and I zip out lining, London fog, double breasted. So I learned about inventory, about shrinkage, display, and I had enough money to buy nice office clothes. But I realized I didn't know how to type. I had never worked in an office. I worked in a nightclub. So I decided I would apply for a job as a corporate service for attorneys. And it was, typing and dictaphone those days. And those were the days when the salespeople would go to 3 martini lunches, and they'd transcribe into their margarine. And so I had to transcribe that. And I got pretty good at it. I learned how to manage people and I got promotion. And then I thought, okay, I know about a little bit about that, but I know nothing about insurance. So I worked for an insurance company. Then I knew nothing about banking. I worked for a bank in merchant services, which at that point was Security Pacific Bank, that was just beginning to change their logo. And I learned about brand marketing. And all throughout this time of working 9 to 5, I volunteered for any theater company that would have me. I'd hang lights, I'd build sets, I'd pour coffee, whatever. So I worked from 9 to 5 and then 6 to midnight for about 6 or 7 or 8 years, nonstop. The first part of the day fed my wallet. The last part of the day fed my soul. And through those connections at night, I got to meet the man who was running the Young Conservatory program at ACT. And he said, there's a job with your name on it. It's development. And I said, I don't know what that is. He said, honey, it's all about parties, special events. You're the nightclub girl. So I got my first job at American Conservatory Theater, and that began my job as nonprofit. And I never looked back. And I learned how to work with volunteers and producing events. And then I eventually worked for the San Francisco Symphony, managing all the 1,700 volunteers and 40-some programs, their black and white ball. So I became an event producer. And then I used my stage management experience to eventually become an executive director. And wouldn't you know that the years of working in insurance and banking has come in handy as a CEO. You know, I never thought, what the hell am I going to do about insurance? I didn't need to know about coats. But at Cal Shakes, where I used to work, I sold sweatshirts because I looked at all the displays. Yeah. So everything comes back. And I always encourage young people to say yes to everything. Join something. Like my father was told, join the Kiwanis Club. Network, be a member of your community. Your life will be so much richer. You will be more informed. You will continue to learn. And in today's day and age, I think that we become so calcified. Sometimes we only want to learn what we want to learn. But I think there's such beauty when you, like moments like these, when we discover people from our hometown, and libraries like these that introduce authors and speakers that bring you to a whole nother world. We need this more than ever today. We're so homogenized. We need to come together, Zoom, in person, whatever it takes, to learn about other stories.
It's time for you guys to ask some questions. So anyone? And I'll repeat them for the Zoom audience.
They got off scot-free.
Question is, what about your siblings in the show?
So my brother was in the show, and my brother is 2 years younger than me, and we were a duo. We were so cute, right? But he outgrew it, and my sister was 10 years older, so she was not home that much. But no, I was the one that they just threw out there. I think that because I was just a little naughty, and my mother just tried to find things for me to do. I was so transfixed by that whole nightclub. And when you think about those days, the pictures I saw about Trader Vic's and all, that's so colorful to a young girl. It's like a coloring book. It was, to me, it was one big coloring book growing up in that restaurant. I was mesmerized by every costume, every light. I just couldn't get my eyes off of it. And perhaps that's drawn me to the world of theater, opera, museums. I love all of that. Yes, fellow Lassiter.
What year did the restaurant open?
Opened 1960. And in the book, I talk about that it started to wane. And there were certain trends that caused the restaurant to decline. One of them was this jazzercise and exercise craze that was entered the country. And suddenly, fat was not good. And suddenly Dexatrim, it was the AIDS supplements, all of these started to come into it. But what really changed was when Nixon went to China and Mao opened the borders again. And after that, a lot of Chinese chefs came bringing their own provinces like Sichuan and Taiwan and Hunan. We didn't have those before. Our restaurant was Cantonese, which Dad always said was good home cooking. So people would come to the restaurant asking to have hot sauce be put on their food. And my father said no, because that's just not the cuisine. But Cantonese food came out of favor because everything was now towards spicy, and so that was one piece of it. But the other piece of it was just people weren't going to nightclubs anymore. People weren't going out to dinner as families. We have stories of people who every Sunday would have dinner at the restaurant as a family. I find that remarkable. They did this for 10 so years, so we would watch each other grow up.
Ma'am.
New York City.
Where in Trader Vic's did you go?
Big Trader Vic's in New York. It was the place to go. We discovered Bib lettuce for the first time. Limestone lettuce is what they called it. Now it's Bib lettuce. Yeah.
Yeah, the first one was out here, but there were several around the country.
Pat, have a question?
Questions about the Chinese-Jewish relationship.
This is hilarious. When I did my ancestry.com, I thought maybe a part of me is Italian because I just love that culture. But no, I'm real Chinese, but a little bit of Korea is in there. But a significant part of where my ancestors came from was an area that the Kaifeng Jews lived, Kiafeng. And the Kaifeng Jews are probably down to maybe 1,000 in number, because they're not allowed to practice in communist China, but they found a way to do it. And so the parts of my ancestors came from that region, which is just outside of our main province. Our family was nomadic. They moved around. It was about 800 miles only from the mothership of where our family base was from. But my mother has always said that she loved the Jewish culture. We had a lot of Jewish customers. My mother thought the wonton soup and matzo ball soup, they're all the same, just put in a different broth. And then she loved the similarities of family unity over holidays. There was a shared culture with the Jewish, and then she used to say, that Chinn is Chinese for Cohen. So we used to think she was nipping a bit at the rock and rye, but there may be some truth to, there's a little bit of maybe some Jewish heritage in my family. It is not out of the realm of possibility because of that proximity to where the Kaifeng Jews are now.
Anyone else? I'll ask one. Who are some of the famous people that rolled into the restaurant?
Well, first of all, my father loved sports. So we had the New York Mets won the pennant in 1969. So he had Ron Swoboda and Ed Kranepool, but he loved to bring people. It became a magnet for people to come to. And so some of the more famous ones were Richard Burton and Liz Taylor would come by because we were close friends with their lawyer. Their lawyer was Aaron Frosch. Aaron Frosch was our family lawyer as well. And Aaron Frosch represented Marilyn Monroe and Joe DiMaggio during their time. But Liz and Dick would stay at Quag on Long Island, where Aaron Frosch had his home. And my father our family friend would go and pick up Liz and Dick from the airport and drive them to Quag, which is a good hour away. Mahjong is on the way. And they would always want to stop by to have a drink. So Mahjong was, the driver, who was a family friend, would say to my father, "I'm going to bring the Burtons home to the restaurant, give them a private area." So one of the dancers remembers that when Liz and Dick came in, they had a private area in the back, and we were told not to gawk at them, but they just fit in. But I remember this funny story I tell in the book. The family friend who was the driver couldn't pick them up from the airport one day. So my father sent my Uncle Teddy to go get them, my uncle who designed TWA. And he was not impressed with Liz and Dick. He said in Chinese, what translates to, not only are they old, but they smell bad. Because they smoked and drank. They were just, he didn't really think there was much to them. But we had quite a lot. We had cardinals. So my mother was a parishioner at Qingdao. And so over the course of 10 years, Mahjong was frequented by one of all of Chinese cardinals. They made a special effort to come to Mahjong to visit my mother from Qingdao. But we had sports personalities and TV anchors, and it was the place to go. I used to say that it was like Cheers before Cheers ever existed. My brother and I were just taught to welcome people as they walked in. Sometimes we'd go and run outside, open their car door and bring them in, and we'd sit at the booth with them so we just sort of, it really was a family. And so now when I look at businesses that bemoan the fact of why aren't customers coming back, theaters, I try to emulate this spirit in every theater that I've run. But the first point of contact is not just when you go to the restaurant, go to the business, it's when you place the order, when you try to get somebody on the phone. And I have learned to combat, and I bemoan the lack of true service in this country. I see a lot of service with a shrug in this country. I think the pandemic is giving reasons for people not to talk to each other. And check yourself out at the supermarket. I think we should bring back personal connections. So I'm just, I think that this is what I hope my book will inspire, is more human connection, because it's much richer than, no offense to Zoom, but it is more different experience.
Some things are tough. I don't want USC and UCLA in the Big Ten either. We're running a little long, but I wanted to ask you to tell us about your godfather.
So I have, my godfather's name is Rocky Sotero. I have an Italian godfather. And this is part of Dad's connections. And this is part of the legions of cast of characters that came into the nightclub. We also had an Uncle Nino and an Aunt Rose, but my uncle, Uncle Rocky is my godfather. And I never really knew him. He was just designated to be a godfather by my father for some reason. I can't remember when Rocky ever took me to anything, but he was just told he was my godfather. But the real godfather in our family was Uncle Nino Loiacano, that I mentioned in my book, who was married to Aunt Rose. And Nino, there's a very famous story about Nino and some of the trouble he got into that is public knowledge, so I'm not divulging anything that's confidential. But there was indictment, embezzlement, all that stuff that's in there. And I remember that we were invited to Nino and Rose's home in Plainview, which is not too far from Syosset. And we were being driven in their car. And my mother said to me, "Don't talk in the car. Don't talk in the car." She thought the car was bugged. And Nino would bring in an entourage of people. And one day he said, "I'm going to bring a special guest." And Nino, being a member of the mob, he had to be cleared by my mother and father. Nobody could come in to say, "I want to sit with Nino." My father had to make sure he was cleared and authorized and allowed to go to Nino's table. We didn't want any kind of bloodshed in the restaurant. But I talk about how some man came in and said, "I'm a friend of Nino's," and my father checked him out. And Nino said he's okay, and my father said, "Go check your coat at the coat check." And my mother, who was the coat check person, said, "Give me your hat and give me your gun." So gave the gun. But that's kind of how we grew up. And Nino was the guy who he would shake our hands, grip it, and when we released it, there was $100 bill in our hand. Yeah. I tell you, if I could make money like that now, that'd be
really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And now we can sell some books. in the back.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for supporting the library. Thank you. Thank you, everybody on Zoom.